It was a crisp November morning in 1984 when Howard Cosell strode onto the set of ABC's Good Morning America. His presence commanding as always, steady voice, growly with conviction, glasses perched purposefully on his nose, aura intact. But by midday, the entire television industry would be buzzing, because in a single moment of unscripted candor, Cosell said something that ABC executives deemed irredeemable, a comment so explosive that within hours he was summarily fired, and his departure became one of the most shocking media scandals of that decade, leaving viewers stunned, colleagues bewildered, and newsrooms scrambling to parse what exactly happened, and ultimately revealing not just the volatile nature of broadcast politics, but the powerful legacy of a man who never softened his voice for comfort or convenience. And while Cosell had long been known for his unapologetic honesty calling fights as he saw them criticizing athletes, politicians, wars, this time he directed his spotlight at the network itself, accusing ABC of hypocrisy and cowardice during a segment ostensibly about journalistic ethics. Stating with characteristic, blunt authority, this network claims integrity. Yet it shields its major sponsors while silencing dissent. You want transparency? Start at your own boardroom. Words that echoed through the studio and eventually made their way into internal memos where network lawyers called them politically hazardous, and executives later testified that the comment was a direct challenge to corporate interests tied to advertising dollars and political alliances, suggesting that Cosell's uncompromising spirit had crossed an invisible boundary that could not be tolerated, and what followed was as formal as it was final. A tour memo from ABC management delivered through back channels informing Cosell the network had decided to end our professional relationship effective, immediately stripping him of remaining on-air appearances. And not long afterward, Cosell issued a brief statement. I never traded truth for tenure. A phrase that quickly became a rallying cry for journalists and fans alike who felt his firing symbolized a broader erosion of free speech in media. But for many longtime viewers, his departure hit deeper. It didn't just remove a voice, it removed a conscience, because Cosell embodied a kind of moral reckoning that few on television dared to voice, and the shockwaves hit fast talk shows, rotated discussion panels overnight. Newspapers ran retrospectives on his career. Fans debated across water coolers and sports bars, while rival networks weighed in with both praise and caution, some calling Cosell a martyr for honesty, others warning other personalities that no one was immune from corporate consequence. And behind the scenes, sources later revealed tensions had simmered for months, fueled when Cosell had publicly criticized advertisers, some of whom were major sponsors of Good Morning America, for influence over editorial decisions. Moments ABC quietly buried, but which insiders say lead executives to view Cosell as a liability, not just an employee, especially after his pointed remark that morning sparked immediate reaction from the suits upstairs, who gathered in emergency sessions to assess potential sponsor withdrawals, stock impacts, and public relations fallouts. And while Cosell was offered a consultant contract rather than an on-air role, he refused, choosing instead to walk away publicly, stating in an interview the following day that broadcasting had become a bargain basement stage for controlled messaging, remarks that cemented his image as reporter and critic both in one and in the days after his firing. Life magazine ran a cover story dubbing him the last watchdog, exploring how a man once beloved for his fight commentary had become a casualty of the evolving media power landscape. While in journalism schools across the country, professors cited the incident as a case study in ethics, censorship, and the balance between advertiser interests and editorial independence. And for football fans, sports writers, and free speech advocates, his removal felt like the closing of a chapter in broadcasting history, a moment when a gatekeeper refused to keep the gates closed. And yet, even as his network presence ended abruptly, the Cosell mystique deepened with cable talk shows lining up interviews, publishers clamoring for an autobiography, and a groundswell of public support that made one thing clear, that in 20 seconds of unfiltered truth, Howard Cosell had delivered far more than controversy. He had delivered clarity, and the world would never look at morning news quite the same way again. And while many television hosts might have faded from public memory after such a scandal, Howard Cosell did precisely the opposite. He became a symbol, an icon, of principled defiance, with universities inviting him to speak on journalistic ethics, civic engagement, and media manipulation, while networks that had once scoffed at his candor suddenly found themselves airing reruns of his old segments as retrospective tributes, trying to cash in on the very legacy they once tried to silence. And all the while, Cosell remained unapologetic, often stating in interviews that he never considered broadcast journalism a popularity contest. And though the media tried to stir debate over whether he had gone too far, millions of Americans felt that he had simply said what needed to be said. What they too had been thinking, that major networks had grown too cozy with corporate dollars, too hesitant to confront real issues when it might ruffle the wrong feathers. And Cosell's career, after ABC, though lacking the glitter of national primetime, flourished in substance. He started a shortwave radio program that reached international listeners, wrote a blistering memoir titled Speaking of Everything I Didn't, and became a mentor to a new generation of journalists who saw him as the last of the truth-first broadcasters. And it was in those university halls and intimate studio settings that he revealed more details about the infamous morning, how he had wrestled with whether to speak up live or off camera, how he sensed ABC's growing intolerance for dissent, how he had watched colleagues muzzle themselves to keep contracts alive, and finally, how he decided that even if it cost him everything, his conscience couldn't remain silent while networks selectively filtered the news. And as he detailed how advertisers had lobbied against entire story segments, how newsrooms were handed guidelines before covering controversial topics, how press freedom was now a transactional commodity, he captivated not just students but veterans of journalism, many of whom admitted they too had faced similar crossroads and had not chosen so boldly. And as more of these stories came out, each more sobering than the last, it became clear that Cosell's firing was not just a moment, but a mirror reflecting the compromised state of media integrity across the board and still in public perception. He remained larger than life. Fans wore shirts that said, "I miss Cosell." A popular documentary titled The Voice That Wouldn't Lower was aired to critical acclaim, and petitions circulated urging PBS to give him a permanent weekly platform. And though he declined most offers, saying truth isn't profitable for networks anymore, he continued to write and speak, dissecting political doublespeak, media framing, and the dangerous rise of entertainment disguised as journalism. And in one particularly gripping interview with Larry King, Cosell stated, "If your paycheck depends on what you won't say, you're not a journalist, you're a performer." Words that ignited debates across social media, newspaper columns, and press rooms, dividing commentators between those who saw him as a heroic purist and those who felt he had burned bridges unnecessarily. But even critics couldn't deny that Cosell's courage had forced the entire industry to look inward, to reconsider how far it had strayed from its mission of truth and public accountability. And, as months passed, his influence only grew stronger. Awards were posthumously named after him. Sports broadcasters began honoring his legacy in subtle nods during live coverage, and journalism schools made his career required reading, often pairing his Speaking of Everything with Orwell and Morrow. And still through it all, Cosell refused to retreat into nostalgia or vicmute. Instead, he continued to speak out, challenging even newer platforms like cable news and digital outlets for chasing ratings over responsibility. And in one memorable keynote speech at the Columbia School of Journalism, he ended with a declaration that echoed through the auditorium. "I was fired for truth, but if truth had no cost, it wouldn't be worth much." And the students erupted in applause, not just for the line, but for the man who had lived it without compromise.